The Mysterious Stranger by Anonymous. Boreas, that fearful northwest wind, which in the spring and autumn stirs up the lowest depths of the wild Adriatic, and is then so dangerous to vessels, was howling through the woods and tossing the branches of the old knotty oaks in the Carpathian mountains, when a party of 5 riders, who surrounded a litter drawn by a pair of mules, turned into a forest path, which offered some protection from the April weather and allowed the travelers in some degree to recover their breath. It was already evening and bitterly cold. The snow fell every now and then in large flakes. A tall old gentleman of aristocratic appearance rode at the head of the troop. This was the Knight of Fandenberg, in Austria. He had inherited from a childless brother a considerable property situated in the Carpathian mountains, and he had set out to take possession of it. Accompanied by his daughter Franziska and a niece about 20 years of age, who had been brought up with her. Next to the knight rode a fine young man, some 20 and odd years, the Baron Franz von Kronstein. He wore, like the former, the broad-brimmed hat with hanging feathers, the leather collar, the wide riding boots. In short, the travelling dress which was in fashion at the commencement of the 17th century. The features of the young man had much about them that was open and friendly, as well as some mind, but the expression was more that of dreamy and sensitive softness than of youthful daring, although no one could deny that he possessed much of youthful beauty. As the cavalcade turned into the oak wood, the young man rode up to the litter and chatted with the ladies who were seated therein. One of these, and to her his conversation was principally addressed, was of dazzling beauty. Her hair flowed in natural curls round the fine oval of her face, out of which beamed a pair of star-like eyes, full of genius, lively fancy, and a certain degree of archness. Franziska von Fandenberg seemed to attend but carelessly to the speeches of her admirer, who made many kind inquiries as to how she felt herself during the journey, which had been attended with many difficulties. She always answered him very shortly, almost contemptuously, and at length remarked that if it had not been for her father's objections, she would long ago have requested the Baron to take her place in their horrid cage of a litter. For, to judge by his remarks, he seemed incommoded by the weather, and she would so much rather be mounted on the spirited horse, and face wind and storm, than be mewed up there, dragged up the hills by those long-eared animals, and mope herself to death with ennui. The young lady's words, and still more the half-contemptuous tone in which they were uttered, appeared to make the most painful impression on the young man. He made her no reply at the moment, but the absent air with which he attended to the kindly intended remarks of the other young lady showed how much he was disconcerted. "It appears, dear Franziska," said he at length in a kindly tone, "that the hardships of the road have affected you more than you will acknowledge. Generally so kind to others, you have been very often out of humour during the journey, and particularly with regard to your humble servant and cousin, who would gladly bear a double or treble share of the discomforts if he could thereby save you from the smallest of them." Franziska showed by her look that she was about to reply with some bitter gibe, when the voice of the knight was heard calling for his nephew, who galloped off at the sound. "I should like to scold you well, Franziska," said her companion somewhat sharply, "for always plaguing your poor cousin Franz in this shameful way. He who loves you so truly, and who, whatever you may say, will one day be your husband." My husband, replied the other angrily. I must either completely alter my ideas, or he his whole self, before that takes place. No, Bertha, I know that this is my father's darling wish, and I do not deny the good qualities cousin Franz may have, or really has, since I see you are making a face. But to marry an effeminate man? Never. Effeminate? You do him great injustice, replied her friend quickly. Just because, instead of going off to the Turkish war, where little honor was to be gained, he attended to your father's advice and stayed at home to bring his neglected estate into order, which he accomplished with care and prudence, and because he does not represent this howling wind as a mild zephyr, for reasons such as these you are pleased to call him effeminate. Say what you will, it is so, cried Franziska obstinately. Bold, aspiring, even despotic must be the man who is to gain my heart. These soft, patient, and thoughtful natures are utterly distasteful to me. Is Franz capable of deep sympathy, either in joy or sorrow? He is always the same, always quiet, soft, and tiresome. He has a warm heart and is not without genius, said Bertha. A warm heart, that may be, replied the other, but I would rather be tyrannized over and kept under a little by my future husband than be loved in such a wearisome manner. You say he has genius, too. I will not exactly contradict you, since that would be unpolite, but it is not easily discovered. But even allowing you are right in both statements, still the man who does not bring these qualities into action is a despicable creature. A man may do many foolish things. He may even be a little wicked now and then, provided it is in nothing dishonorable, and one can forgive him if he is only acting on some fixed theory for some special object. There is, for instance, your own faithful admirer, the Castellan of Glogau, Knight of Wetzlar. He loves you most truly, and is now quite in a position to enable you to marry comfortably. The brave man has lost his right hand, reason enough for remaining seated behind the stove or near the spinning wheel of his Bertha. But what does he do? He goes off to the war in Turkey. He fights for a noble thought, and runs the chance of getting his other hand chopped off and another great scar across his face, put in her friend. Leaves his lady love to weep and pine a little, pursued Franziska, but returns with fame, marries, and is all the more honoured and admired. This is done by a man of 40, a rough warrior, not bred at court, a soldier who has nothing but his cloak and sword. And Franz, rich, noble. But I will not go on, not a word more on this detested point, if you love me, Bertha. Franziska leaned back in the corner of the litter with a dissatisfied air, and shut her eyes as though overcome by fatigue she was to sleep. This awful wind is so powerful, you say, that we must make a detour to avoid its full force, said the knight to an old man dressed in a fur cap and a cloak of rough skin, who seemed to be the guide of the party. Those who have never felt personally the boreas storming over the country between Ceseno and Trieste can have no conception of the reality, replied the other. As soon as it commences, the snow is blown in thick, long columns along the ground. That is nothing to what follows. These columns become higher and higher as the wind rises, and continue to do so until you see nothing but snow above, below, and on every side, unless, indeed, sometimes when sand and gravel are mixed with the snow, and at length it is impossible to open your eyes at all, your only plan for safety is to wrap your cloak around you and lie down flat on the ground. If your home were but a few hundred yards off, you might lose your life in the attempt to reach it. Well, then, we owe you thanks, old Kumpen, said the knight, though it was with difficulty he made his words heard above the roaring of the storm. We owe you thanks for taking us this round, as we shall thus be enabled to reach our as we shall thus be enabled to reach our destination without danger." "You may feel sure of that, noble sir," said the old man. "By midnight we shall have arrived, and that without any danger by the way, if—" Suddenly the old man stopped. He drew his horse sharply up and remained in an attitude of attentive listening. "It appears to me we must be in the neighborhood of some village," said Franz von Kronstein, "for between the gusts of the storm I hear a dog howling." "It is no dog, it is no dog," said the old man uneasily, and urging his horse to a rapid pace. "For miles around there is no human dwelling, and except in the castle of Klatka, which indeed lies in the neighborhood but has been deserted for more than a century, probably no one has lived here since the creation. But there again," he continued, "well, if I wasn't sure of it from the first—" "That howling seems to fidget you, old Kumpen," said the knight, listening to a long-drawn, fierce sound which appeared nearer than before, and seemed to be answered from a distance. "That howling comes from no dogs," replied the old guide uneasily. "Those are reed-wolves. They may be on our track, and it would be as well if the gentlemen looked to their firearms." "Reed-wolves? What do you mean?" inquired Franz in surprise. "At the edge of this wood," said Kumpen, "there lies a lake about a mile long, whose banks are covered with reeds. In these a number of wolves have taken up their quarters, and feed on wild birds, fish, and such like. They are shy in the summer time, and a boy of 12 might scare them. But when the birds migrate and the fish are frozen up, they prowl about at night, and then they are dangerous. They are worst, however, when Boreas rages, for then it is just as if the fiend himself possessed them. They are so mad and fierce that man and beast become alike their victims, and a party of them have been known even to attack the ferocious bears of these mountains, and, what is more, to come off victorious." The howl was now again repeated more distinctly, and from two opposite directions. The riders in alarm felt for their pistols, and the old man grasped the spear which hung at his saddle. "We must keep close to the litter. The wolves are very near us," whispered the guide. The riders turned their horses, surrounded the litter, and the knight informed the ladies, in a few quieting words, of the cause of this movement. "Then we shall have an adventure, some little variety," cried Franziska with sparkling eyes. "How can you talk so foolishly?" said Bertha in alarm. "Are we not under manly protection? Is not cousin Franz on our side?" said the other mockingly. "See, there is a light gleaming among the twigs, and there is another," cried Bertha. "There must be people close to us." "No, no," cried the guide quickly. "Shut up the door, ladies. Keep close together." "Shut up the door, ladies. Keep close together, gentlemen. It is the eyes of wolves you see sparkling there." The gentlemen looked towards the thick underwood, in which every now and then little bright spots appeared, such as in summer would have been taken for glow-worms. It was just the same greenish-yellow light, but less unsteady, and there were always two flames together. The horses began to be restive. They kicked and dragged at the rein, but the mules behaved tolerably well. "I will fire on the beasts and teach them to keep their distance," said Franz, pointing to the spot where the lights were thickest. "Hold, hold, Sir Baron," cried Kumpen quickly, and seizing the young man's arm. "You would bring such a host together by the report that, encouraged by numbers, they would be sure to make the first assault. However, keep your arms in readiness, and if an old she-wolf springs out, for these always lead the attack, take good aim and kill her, for then there must be no further hesitation." By this time the horses were almost unmanageable, and terror had also infected the mules. Just as Franz was turning toward the litter to say a word to his cousin, an animal, about the size of a large hound, sprang from the thicket and seized the foremost mule. "Fire, Baron! A wolf!" shouted the guide. The young man fired, and the wolf fell to the ground. A fearful howl rang through the wood. "Now forward, forward, without a moment's delay," cried Kumpen. "We have not above 5 minutes' time. The beasts will tear their wounded comrade to pieces, and if they are very hungry, partially devour her. We shall in the meantime gain a little start, and it is not more than an hour's ride to the end of the forest. There, do you see? These are the towers of Klatka between the trees, out there where the moon is rising, and from that point the wood becomes less dense." The travellers endeavoured to increase their pace to the utmost, but the litter retarded their progress. Bertha was weeping with fear, and even Franziska's courage had diminished, for she sat very still. Franz endeavoured to reassure them. They had not proceeded many moments when the howling recommenced, and approached nearer and nearer. "There they are again, and fiercer and more numerous than before," "There they are again, and fiercer and more numerous than before," cried the guard in alarm. The lights were soon visible again, and certainly in greater numbers. The wood had already become less thick, and the snowstorm having ceased, the moonbeams discovered many a dusky form amongst the trees, keeping together like a pack of hounds, and advancing nearer and nearer, till they were within 20 paces, and on the very path of the travellers. From time to time a fierce howl arose from their centre, which was answered by the whole pack, and was at length taken up by single voices in the distance. The party now found themselves some few hundred yards from the ruined castle of which Kumpen had spoken. It was, or seemed by moonlight to be, of some magnitude. Near the tolerably preserved principal building lay the ruins of a church, which must have once been beautiful, placed on a little hillock, dotted with single oak trees and bramble bushes. Both castle and church were still partially roofed in, and a path led from the castle gate to an old oak tree, where it joined at right angles the one along which the travellers were advancing. The old guide seemed in much perplexity. "We are in great danger, noble sir," said he. "The wolves will very soon make a general attack. There will then be only one way of escape, leaving the mules to their fate and taking the young ladies on your horses." "That would be all very well if I had not thought of a better plan," replied the knight. "Here is the ruined castle. We can surely reach that, and then, blocking up the gates, we must just await the morning." "Here? In the ruins of Klatka?" "Not for all the wolves in the world," cried the old man. "Even by daylight no one likes to approach the place, and now by night. The castle, Sir Knight." "The castle, Sir Knight, has a bad name." "On account of robbers?" asked Franz. "No, sir, it is haunted," replied the other. "Stuff and nonsense," said the Baron. "Forward to the ruins. There is not a moment to be lost." And this was indeed the case. The ferocious beasts were but a few steps behind the travellers. Every now and then they retired and set up a ferocious howl. The party had just arrived at the old oak before mentioned, and were about to turn into the path to the ruins, when the animals, as though perceiving the risk they ran of losing their prey, came so near that a lance could easily have struck them. The knight and Franz faced sharply about, spurring their horses amidst the advancing crowds, when suddenly from the shadow of the oak stepped forth a man, who in a few strides placed himself between the travellers and their pursuers. As far as one could see in the dusky light, the stranger was a man of a tall and well-built frame. He wore a sword by his side, and a broad-brimmed hat was on his head. If the party were astonished at his sudden appearance, they were still more so at what followed. As soon as the stranger appeared, the wolves gave over their pursuit, rumbled over each other, and set up a fearful howl. The stranger now raised his hand, appeared to wave it, and the wild animals crawled back into the thickets like a pack of beaten hounds. Without casting a glance at the travellers, who were too much overcome by astonishment to speak, the stranger went up the path which led to the castle, and soon disappeared beneath the gateway. "Heaven have mercy on us," murmured old Kumpen in his beard, as he made the sign of the cross. "Who was that strange man?" asked the knight with surprise, when he had watched the stranger as long as he was visible, and the party had resumed their way. The old guide pretended not to understand, and riding up to the mules, busied himself with arranging the harness, which had become disordered in their haste. More than a quarter of an hour elapsed before he rejoined them. "Did you know the man who met us near the ruins, and who freed us from our four-footed pursuers in such a miraculous way?" asked Franz of the guide. "Do I know him? No, noble sir, I never saw him before," replied the guide hesitatingly. "He looked like a soldier and was armed," said the baron. "Is the castle then inhabited?" "Not for the last 100 years," replied the others. "It was dismantled because the possessor in those days had iniquitous dealings with some Turkish Sclavonian hordes, who had advanced as far as this, or rather—" He corrected himself hastily. "He is said to have had such, for he might have been an upright and good a man as ever ate cheese fried in butter." "And who is now the possessor of the ruins of these woods?" inquired the knight. "Who but yourself, noble sir?" replied Kumpen. "For more than 2 hours we have been on your estate, and we shall soon reach the end of the wood." "We hear and see nothing more of the wolves," said the baron after a pause. "Even their howling has ceased. The adventure with the stranger still remains to me inexplicable, even if one were to suppose him a huntsman." Yes, that is most likely what he is," interrupted the guide hastily, whilst he looked uneasily around him. "The brave good man who came so opportunely to our assistance must have been a huntsman. Oh, there are many powerful woodsmen in this neighborhood." "Heaven be praised," he continued, taking a deep breath. "There is the end of the wood, and in a short hour we shall be safely housed." And so it happened. Before an hour had elapsed, the party passed through a well-built village, the principal spot on the estate, towards the venerable castle, the windows of which were brightly illuminated, and at the door stood the steward and other dependents, who, having received their new lord with every expression of respect, conducted the party to the splendidly furnished apartments. Nearly 4 weeks passed before the travelling adventurers again came on the tapis. The knight and Franz found such constant employment in looking over all the particulars of the large estate and endeavouring to introduce various German improvements, that they were very little at home. At first Franziska was charmed with everything in a neighbourhood so entirely new and unknown. It appeared to her so romantic, so very different from her German fatherland, that she took the greatest interest in everything, and often drew comparisons between the countries, which generally ended unfavourably for Germany. Bertha was of exactly the contrary opinion. She laughed at her cousin, and said that her liking for novelty and strange sights must indeed have come to a pass, when she preferred hovels in which the smoke went out of the doors and windows instead of the chimney, walls covered with soot, and inhabitants not much cleaner, and of unmannerly habits, to the comfortable dwellings and polite people of Germany. However, Franziska persisted in her notions, and replied that everything in Austria was flat, inuent, and common, and that a wild peasant here, with his rough coat of skin, had 10 times more interest for her than a quiet Austrian in his holiday suit, the mere sight of whom was enough to make one yawn. As soon as the knight had got the first arrangements into some degree of order, the party found themselves more together again. Franz continued to show great attention to his cousin, which, however, she received with little gratitude, for she made him the butt of all her fanciful humours, that soon returned when, after a longer sojourn, she had become more accustomed to her new life. Many excursions into the neighbourhood were undertaken, but there was little variety in the scenery, and there soon ceased to amuse. The party were one day assembled in the old-fashioned hall. Dinner had just been removed, and they were arranging in which direction they should ride. "I have it!" cried Franziska suddenly. "I wonder we never thought before of going to view by day the spot where we fell in with our night adventure, with wolves and the mysterious stranger." "You mean a visit to the ruins? What were they called?" said the knight. "Castle Klatka," cried Franziska gaily. "Oh, we really must ride there. It will be so charming to go over again by daylight, and in safety, the ground where we had such a dreadful fright." "No, well, bring round the horses," said the knight to a servant. "Bring round the horses," said the knight to a servant, "and tell the steward to come to me immediately." The latter, an old man, soon after entered the room. "We intend taking a ride to Klatka," said the knight. "We had an adventure there on our road." "So old Kumpen told me," interrupted the steward. "What do you say about it?" asked the knight. "I really don't know what to say," replied the old man, shaking his head. "I was a youth of 20 when I first came to this castle, and now my hair is grey. Half a century has elapsed during that time. Hundreds of times my duty has called me into the neighbourhood of those ruins, but never have I seen the fiend of Klatka." "What do you say? Whom do you call by that name?" inquired Franziska, whose love of adventure and romance was strongly awakened. "What do you say? Whom do you call by that name?" inquired Franziska, whose love of adventure and romance was strongly awakened. "Why, people call by that name the ghost or spirit who is supposed to haunt the ruins," replied the steward. "They say he only shows himself on moonlit nights." "That is quite natural," interrupted Franz, smiling. "Ghosts can never bear the light of day, and if the moon did not shine, how could the ghost be seen? For it is not supposed that any one for a mere freak would visit the ruins by torchlight." "There are some credulous people who pretend to have seen this ghost," continued the steward. "Huntsmen and woodcutters say they have met him by the large oak on the cross path. That, noble sir, is supposed to be the spot he inclines most to haunt, for the tree was planted in remembrance of the man who fell there." "And who was he?" asked Franziska with increasing curiosity. "The last owner of the castle, which at that time was a sort of robber's den, and headquarters of all depredators in the neighbourhood," answered the old man. "They say this man was of superhuman strength, and was feared not only on account of his passionate temper, but of his treaties with the Turkish hordes. Any young woman, too, in the neighbourhood to whom he took a fancy was carried off to his tower and never heard of more.